This is Todd Pierce. I'm here in Leesburg, Virginia with retired Brigadier General John Johns. It's August 11th, 2018, and I'd like to talk to Brigadier General Johns about his Army career and his work since he's retired. General Johns, could you explain how it is you began in the Army as a place to start?
Oh, well, I was from not a well-to-do family, and I needed to go to college, so I enlisted in the Army to get the GI Bill into World War II. Got out, went back to school, the University of Alabama, and took ROTC to supplement my income. And lo and behold, halfway through law school, they offered me a regular commission as a distinguished military graduate, so I came back in the Army. I was an artillery officer, expected to go to Korea, but instead went to Germany. Came back to Fort Carson, Colorado, liked the Army, and the Army decided to send me to graduate school in psychology to Vanderbilt. So I ended up with many assignments having to do with social science. First one with counterinsurgency, which is a political issue. We have not quite learned that yet, that it's a war of ideas, that you cannot win it with conventional military power. So that led to one thing after another.
So I've heard you referred to by credible people as one of the great intellects of the Army, and I think with your writing and your positions that would hold that to be true. So maybe you could, one of your first positions was, or what you were engaged in to begin with as research was in COIN, Counter-Insurgency, as you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Could you get into that more? How did you begin in that? And then tell us more about it, and then how it applied in Vietnam.
Sure. Let me say that I've always been intellectually curious. What makes an intellect is one man's folly is another man's wisdom. But I've always been intellectually curious. And when I became interested in psychology, I went to Vanderbilt fully expecting to go to West Point to teach, but I got extended an extra semester and they sent me to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. At that time, it was the Special Warfare Center, later the John F. Kennedy Center. And as a psychologist, I was interested in the hearts and minds parts of this. Fortunately, the Brigadier General there, William P. Yarborough, was also open to that, as was the Director of Instruction, Lieutenant Colonel Wilson, Sam Wilson, who himself was, I think, a real intellect. He retired as a Lieutenant General. So midway through my tour there, General Yarborough said he wanted us to look at broadening the psychological warfare course and the what we called then counter-guerrilla course. And he said those two things needed to be matched. And Sam Wilson, who was an INR platoon leader for Maryland Marauders, and Logan Weston, a lieutenant colonel who's the other INR platoon leader for Maryland Marauders, both of them received Distinguished Service Cross for those. They were there, and the three of us put together a new course called the Counter-Insurgency course. That's different than guerrilla warfare. It's different than just psychological operations like World War II. It involves a sense of building nationhood, building a positive approach to the government. That's counterinsurgency. And it relies less on conventional military power and more on a subtle approach of war of ideas. Now, we had a tough time getting across this to an army that had been focused on body counts.
What year was this? And let me ask.
That's 1960 to 62.
Okay, and Yarborough was a founder of the Green Berets.
He was the founder of the Green Berets.
Merle's Marauders were a famous military unit in World War II.
In World War II, that's right, in Burma. That's correct. And Logan Weston and Sam Wilson. Sam Wilson was a 17-year-old lieutenant in Merle's Marauders. If I can tell you a little vignette.
Please do.
Logan Weston was an ordained Baptist minister. And he was allowed to select the 50 men for his INR platoon. And he said, "Do you believe in a higher power?" Because he was the Baptist minister. Sam Wilson told him to fall out the 100 meanest men in the stockade. 17-year-old lieutenant walked up to the first man and said, "Do you think you're tough enough to do this or this?" And this soldier said, "Yes." "Yes, what?" "Yes, sir." That was Sam Wilson, 17 years old.
That's amazing. What's an INR team? Could you tell?
That's intelligence and reconnaissance.
Okay.
They're the most dangerous of military, going out alone to do intelligence and research. Reconnaissance, yes. So those were the two people that I sat down with, and we developed the first counterinsurgency course. Mine was the Hearts and Minds. One of our first students was a captain from the Philippines, Fidel Ramos, known as Eddie, who became Chief of Staff of the Philippine Army, Secretary of Defense of the Philippine Army, and President. Class of 1950 from West Point, Eddie Ramos.
And is he who worked with Ed Lansdale in the Philippines?
No, he had not. He was young for that,
Okay.
but Eddie Ramos is still alive. He's 90 years old. But he was one of the first students of that course.
So could you tell us what ideas you developed and how you...
Well, the notion of counterinsurgency then, later written in Army doctrine of nation building a sense of nationhood, was that you have to get people to support your operations, to give you intelligence and logistical support, and win what we call hearts and minds. And the idea was to minimize damage to civilians, even collateral damage. And I remember one of the students was Colonel George Mabry, who had a Medal of Honor as a battalion commander in World War II. He was a colonel then. He later made Major General. But Colonel Mabry got up in one of the classes and said, "If any of you are under my command and you mistreat civilians, I'll court-martial you because that'll lose the war." Not everyone accepted that. You know the history of trying to get counterinsurgency training. We repeated some of the same mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is very difficult to get soldiers in combat who are led into traps and ambushes, sometimes by children, women, and others. It is very difficult to get them not to commit atrocities, such as you had in My Lai, a rampage by a platoon of the 101st Airborne called Tiger Force. It went on a rampage, documented Nightline by Ted Koppel, showing people being interviewed saying, yes, I shot farmers in the rice paddies because I didn't trust them. That's well documented. Most American soldiers were good soldiers, but under the frustration of insurgency and the kind of battles you have, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, as well as Vietnam, you're going to have atrocities. Now, I volunteered to go to Vietnam. This was in the fall of '61. And I went there in May of 1962 and was assigned to the political warfare school of Vietnam. I taught a 30-hour course there because many of the students and the faculty there had been students of mine at Fort Bragg. So they asked me to teach a 30-hour course. An interpreter, a Vietnamese with a PhD in anthropology from Cambridge. He spoke perfect English. This young man took me to tea houses and other places in Vietnam, and he said, you can decide if you've been talking to Viet Cong sympathizers, Viet Cong, or whatever. I want you to hear the other side of the psychological equation here. And I remember in one of my classes, there were 300 people in that class. And I said, how many of you are from the countryside rather than the cities? They were all officers. One person raised his hand. A Montagnard. Can I ask you, do you think your fellow officers, your comrades here from the cities, really understand how the peasants look at this? And he said, no, they can't. Now that tells you, these were good officers. Some of them were good friends who invited me to their home. But they largely Catholic from the cities, and they were fighting largely a Buddhist peasantry who were not French-speaking, were not Catholic. When you look at that, when I came back from Vietnam, I went to Leavenworth to the Commanding General Staff College. And I said to one of the speakers, the Marine Corps Commandant, General Wallace Green, you've missed the target. This is not a military campaign. He had said, and this is reported in the Best and Brightest, the Halberstam. He cites this on one of his pages of Wallace Green, saying this. When General Green said, I would start off by putting a battalion of Marines in each of the 4 areas. And if it took more, I would add more Marines to put this down. And I said, General, you have completely missed what this is about. And he kept me on my feet for several minutes, about 10 minutes, give and take. General Lemley was the commandant He sent me a note the next day and said, "Congratulations. Whether I agree with you or not, you took him on and brought up questions." Well, I went back then to Office of Chief of Research and Development out of Leavenworth. And I was in the human resources part of research and development. And I came up with an idea of studying what causes social unrest that leads to violence in developing countries. And it was labeled Project Camelot, which most sociologists know about Project Camelot in the early 60s. And the idea was to get a group of social scientists to look at social unrest that turns to violence. And once it turns to violence and you start using excessive counter force, you've lost the battle. The time to stop it, the unrest, is correct the conditions that are causing the unrest. And that's extremely difficult to do. We had a plan to do this research with up to 50 professional social scientists at one time. It was a big deal to get this support. We were going to do it in Latin America, which at that time had the buddings of social unrest. The National Academy of Sciences appointed a 20-person panel to advise us, with some of the big names in the United States, including people who had written about social unrest in the United States, propaganda. Leonard Doob, a psychologist from Yale, was one of them. Richard T. LaPierre, a sociologist from Stanford, was one of them. Well, one of these members of the National Academy of Sciences had a fellow anthropologist student at the professor at the University of Pittsburgh, who was a graduate of the Naval Academy of Chile in Latin America, and had been a Fulbright scholar. And he said, "I would like to see if I can get some of this research done in Chile." At that time had been a peaceful change. And Hugo Nutini was his name, and he went to a meeting in Chile, in Santiago, in which he met a social scientist from Scandinavia who was attending this international meeting. And he asked Nutini who was funding this. Nutini told him it was the National Academy of Sciences. It was, in fact, the United States Army, which was not classified. Now, unfortunately, the Swedish sociologist, a Norwegian sociologist, had received a letter from one of the members of the National Academy of Sciences encouraging him to join this group and telling him it was funded by the Defense University. I didn't get a minute off for the next 3 months till that was worldwide news. CIA plots overthrow of the Chile government under the guise of Project Camelot. But let me tell you, Todd, That project looked at the social movement that holds today. What will cause people to give allegiance to any group? And the model, the theory that was developed by Dr. Richard T. LaPierre in the 1930s, in 1938, is still valid today. We could not follow that, could not follow through with it, but I learned then that the answer to this has to be a social psychology understanding of what causes this unrest. Now, most people know that now, but they don't know how to do the winds and hearts and minds. Then I was assigned to DESOPS, Deputy Chief Staff for Operations in Department of the Army. And I was asked to write a study on how you build a sense of nationhood. And I wrote 2 studies that are written in the Army history. One of them was psychological operation, role in establishing a sense of nationhood, PSYOP reason, how you use information to build a sense of nationhood, get the peasantry throughout the country to build how we built a sense of nationhood in the United States. National anthem, ritual and ceremony. We do this systematically through our Constitution. Well, I wrote that, and the Secretary of the Army came back and said, tell me specifically what the Army's role is in building a sense of nationhood. And that study, Nation Building, Contributions of the Army, which I used Nabucco, after one of my favorite operas, Nabucco, but Nation Building, Contributions of the Army, and the Secretary of the Army directed that that be distributed as policy guidance for curriculum development and doctrinal development. This was in late 1968. Now, that was sent out close hold because the State Department, USA, will think we're getting in their business by using, because I said in this study, the Army reaches to the bottom of most societies. If you get them to take care of people, respect them, and they have a role. The other services have a role. The civilian, the police, most of it is not military, the police, but get police to quit abusing people. They represent the government. They're the face of the national government. And if you want a sense of nationhood, this was all in research that I had learned from this National Academy of Sciences panel before Camelot. So I became sort of the face of counterinsurgency throughout the Army. And then decided I'm going to retire, turned down a battalion, and was asked to come to West Point to teach. So I turned down a battalion and went to West Point to teach psychology and leadership. No more counterinsurgency. And I met a young Brigadier General Commandant, Bernard Rogers. Bernie Rogers was Commandant. And he asked me to tell him about this work I was doing. After that, I didn't really have anything else to do with counterinsurgency.
This might interest you. I just came back from Northern Ireland, spending a few days over there in July. And they still have, they have the peace agreement, so they are working very hard to maintain peace and reconcile differences. But there's still graffiti around. Frequently, repression breeds resistance. And I talked to some of the people, and there's a book written by it, about it. But one of the main provocations or motivations for people to join the IRA was the Easter Sunday massacre by the British paratroopers, where they came in and did treat demonstrators very harshly, which, when you read things in South Vietnam too, was being done at different times. So what was your personal experience with South Vietnam and how they were applying counterinsurgency or maintaining population control there? Was there a problem, I guess is what I'm asking, because I know you've been a critic of it.
It was very difficult to do because, as the senior advisor to the political warfare school, that was the outfit responsible for this. Mm-hmm. General Yarborough had asked them to assign me there to take this idea over there, and they adopted it. I don't think it was the Vietnamese army that, as I mentioned before, their officers' corps was from the urban areas. Most of them spoke French. They were largely Catholic, not Buddhist. And it was Notre Dame's philosophy was from two French priests, Catholic priests, personalism. But it was Catholic oriented, and that was what they were told to say to the people. I thought, and my interpreter, who had the PhD in anthropology personally, did not think that was the message to get the peasant to support the central government. I don't believe it was the Vietnamese army that did as much damage as the American army and our body count and focus on the kinetic portion of force. And I think we had so many atrocities, and don't tell me that My Lai and Tiger Force were the only. I sat on the committee that monitored.
Yeah, can you tell us more about the committee that you were on?
There was a committee of 10. I was a lieutenant colonel in the office of Chief Staff of the Army. The committee chair was Murray Williams, a colonel in Des Peres. We monitored war crimes. It was a colonel, class of 50, in my office, that had all of the files. Tony Herbert, who became quite well known. There were documented 100 convictions of war crimes by Americans that you've never heard about. The American command wanted to control this, but they closed their eyes, had to, like they did in My Lai. As you know, Sam Coster got reduced after he was the commander of Marechal Division. That was the one that committed My Lai. And then he became superintendent of West Point, but then busted to 1 star.
Because of My Lai?
After My Lai, and not following through with it. And you can read the Pierce report. Ray Pierce, a lieutenant general, a personal acquaintance of mine.
Which is why I'm keeping an eye on here, so pardon me for that.
Sure.
You were saying, General Johns, about what the United States must avoid as far as when it's dealing with other countries. Could you pick up on that again, please?
We must avoid the notion that with proper training of the military, that we can go into other countries and put down violence in those countries with the military, this counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency must be done by local institutions, local police, and even in those, in diverse countries of different religions and so forth. It's all, Northern Ireland is a good example of where religion makes force counterproductive. The United States has no role for boots on the ground of military. I want to emphasize this. It has no role. Don't tell me with proper training and proper leadership you can do this. Can we learn nothing from Vietnam? Can we learn nothing from Iraq? Afghanistan, we've been there 17 years, and someone comes in with a new idea, and this new idea, they're going to show progress, they're going to do this, that. Syria? Why do we insist philosophically that liberal democracy is the political system for every country in the world?
And whatever you call it, it seems to me that they're always going to see what we're trying to impose as imperial control and foreign imperialism, which always generates resistance.
Let me tell you one example. When Chief of Staff of the Army, General Harold K. Johnson, made the decision for the U.S. to go into Vietnam and pacify Vietnam. The study was called Pacification Republic of Vietnam, PROVN, P-R-O-V-N, Pacification Republic of Vietnam. The briefer was Lieutenant Colonel Volney F. Warner. And when he finished the briefing, which in essence, we'll go in and pacify Vietnam and then turn it over to the Vietnamese, U.S. forces. I had none concurred as a major when I was in research and development, because I had done this study of Project Camelot and others, but my boss, the Major General, overrode mine and recommended we do this. When he finished the briefing, General Harold K. Johnson, sitting at the head of the table, said, "Any questions or comments?" The senior lieutenant general was Throckmorton, sitting to his left. And he said, "If we do this, it'll be the most serious foreign policy mistake we've ever made. We'll never be able to disengage with honor. They will see this as French imperialism coming back," just as you said. General Harold K. Johnson said, "We'll cross the bridge of disengagement when we get to it." Any other comments? And there was I was a major, and I had been invited to this. I was the only relative coolie there. Some big, tall brigadier general turned to me and said, "Does he realize he's just cut off all kind of discussion? What a goddamn decision." I don't know who that brigadier general was, but there were warnings. This was 1965.
I've read that General Wyand said from the very beginning, not publicly, maybe not privately, but leaked it at least to some reporters, that the war was always unwinnable. He recognized that from the beginning. Did you ever hear that of him? And you mentioned earlier how many general officers at least came out later and said that they thought the war had always been unwinnable.
Some of them, but none of them spoke out.
Yeah.
The only one that spoke out even during that was General David Shoup. But David Shoup was on the Joint Chiefs when they made the decision to go in, and he wrote an article in magazine article in 1969 and said, I should have resigned then because I knew that was unwinnable. We shouldn't go in there. That was before we went in with the troops in the Drain Valley and that. And you may remember in the movie We Were Soldiers Once, the commander of that battalion had been promoted to full colonel. The commander of the Drain Valley, Harold Moore. Hal Moore was called to Vietnam, to Saigon to brief Secretary of Defense in Westmoreland. And Secretary of Defense and General Hal Moore told me this was the truth. He said, we've shown them that we're going to bloody their nose and we're going to send those little bastards back home to North Vietnam. And Colonel Moore said, sir, you're not going to send them home. They are home. They see this as their home.
Westmoreland had said that first about sending them home?
No, it's either Westmoreland or McNamara.
Okay.
So I don't know which one, and Hal Moore is dead, but Hal Moore told me I know him real well. We've been dear friends for many, many years. And Hal Moore told me then, he said, you got this read wrong. The way they fought, they are home. Todd, if I could get anything across to American people and the leaders, they still don't get this. That social unrest based on the grievances of the people when they do not see legitimacy in their government, once you start having to use physical force, whether it be police force at Ferguson, whether it be police force for race rights in the United States, why don't they do like a brigade commander, chief of staff of the 82nd Airborne led a brigade out to Wounded Knee to put down the Indian. I read in the last month a letter from one of the Indians that was there that had met the granddaughter of now retired General Volney Warner. I will email you a copy of that, in which he said, you saved the day for the American government the way you came in and handled us with respect. That's the way you handle it. But we cannot do that. Now, Volney Warner, if he were well today, he would tell you it was never winnable. It was theirs to win or lose. And he has said that in public speeches before. Now, his granddaughter, a West Point graduate, was the first female killed in Afghanistan. The first West Point graduate, Laura Walker. Volney can't speak out against things like that because of that, because people would think it's a personal thing, but he has long held. If he gave a speech when he came back and said, as a lieutenant colonel over there, as I'd travel around and I asked myself, if I were a Vietnamese peasant, I'd probably be a Viet Cong. Volney had gone to graduate school in psychology with me at Vanderbilt. Volney grew to be, went from full colonel to 4 stars in 6 years. Volney made his name as a soldier, a lieutenant in Korea and so forth. But he has enough sense to know that.
I mentioned how the paratroopers, the British paratroopers, went in to Northern Ireland and ended up killing, they were brought in and put down what was described as unrest, and they killed 13 or maybe more Northern Irish Republicans, the Catholics, and that's what really rallied so many people outside of Northern Ireland even. They saw such repression, military repression, that they knew they had no choice but to resist in their minds.
Todd, I have talked to so many people, hardline military, who believe that you can kill people and bend them to your will. And we've got some leaders, political leaders, who believe that today. I won't name, we've always had that. It's just you didn't care enough. You didn't do enough of that. If you kill enough people and treat them, you'll win.
That's what the Germans believed too, back in the 1940s. But if I may add something, if you look at a situation map today compared to September 12th, 2001, we had a very small group of terrorists to attack the United States. And now we have exactly as people predicted, some people, the rational people predicted, is like kicking a beehive. And it's global now.
In your files, you will have a paper I wrote on the 22nd of September 2002. My prediction of what will happen in the Middle East if we invade Iraq. I wrote that for a meeting that a former congressman, Republican from California, had asked me to prepare for a meeting, wanted me to get some senior generals and admirals together here. He would fly back because he had been talking to George Bush Sr. and others try to talk my son out of being misled by Dick Cheney and the neocons. It will be a disaster for us to go into Iraq. And read our article, our book, and then an article for the Wall Street Journal by Brent Scrocloff saying, here's why we didn't go into Baghdad and why you shouldn't do it. I said it to General Tony Zenit that 22 September 2002, read it and see what has happened. It seems to me, I don't care whether I'm an intellectual or I try to step back and say, what makes sense? Can't we learn from the guns of August? This is what you would have now in the guns of August if you started using tactical nukes.
And for anybody not familiar, Guns of August was the beginning of World War I. Right?
That's right. Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, when nobody wanted war. The King of England and the Tsar, the head of the German, were cousins. They were saying, let's prevent this. But we cannot back down. We cannot show weakness. So we move these up and then somebody shoots the Archduke. 4 years later, you've got you don't have a second choice with nukes.
So maybe we could segue from there. You're an expert on nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence. Would you want to talk about that? How did you move into that field?
Todd, nobody is an expert in nuclear weapons because we've only used them twice. Those people are dead. Those situations were unique. The situation today, and let me just give you a little background. The first time I ever knew about nukes was I was a lieutenant in Fort Carson, Colorado, and I was one of the few people in 1956 that had clearance, security clearance, to babysit some nukes from Pennsylvania over to Germany, and I had to stay with them and sign these nuke weapons. So I knew then we were putting nukes all over Europe in the mid-50s. Then I went to the advanced course and got a certification to use tactical nukes.
And describe what a tactical nuke is compared to...
Yes, used on the battlefield.
Okay.
Small nukes, not missiles, not airplanes, but artillery. And I became certified as what they call prefix 5, how to plot targets, push the soldiers, the enemy, into valleys and groups, and then see what the target was and what kind of nuke we need our artillery to shoot nuclear weapon. And you had to factor in the wind. If the wind shifts and you get this fallout, it comes back on your soldiers.
Like they learned in World War I with gas.
Gas. And I said, a lot of us sat around and talked and said, this is crazy. This is crazy. You can never use nukes. But if I had been shipped off and told to use nukes, I would have used nukes. Because I thought the people above me had better knowledge. Otherwise, I should resign my commission. But I will tell you, in 56, 57, 57, 58 in the advanced course, I learned what nukes could do. When I went to Leavenworth, I learned more. And I said, this is crazy. But where it really hit me, when I was assigned as the assistant division commander of the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division. And as the ADC for maneuver and training, I read all of our war plans, how we had pre-positioned stock. We would fly over, we had nuclear weapons there, and in the Fulda Gap, if we had the Warsaw Pact coming in, we were to push them into valleys to get the maximum effect from nuke. I looked at this, and I asked my boss, when I go over to visit my German counterpart, what do they say about using nukes on their cities, on their land, on their people? He said, you don't talk about it. Now, if I were not willing to execute that, knowing that it was immoral, counterproductive, you're going to have all-out nuclear war. By the late 70s, and nobody questioned that. But I didn't resign. Would I have done it? I cannot honestly answer that I would not have destroyed humanity, because that was our doctrine. And the doctrine was mutually assured destruction, as it became the call, because we knew that would be mutually destroyed. Both sides will be destroyed. Later, when I retired and taught at the National Defense University, I had occasion to interact with dozens of retired four-stars, people like Noel Geiler. Admiral Noel Geiler became a very close friend. He was St. Pacon. He told me at once, he sent back in, they had to say, how many nukes do you need? And he told them none. And Admiral Radford, I guess, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs then, a real hardliner, told Schlesinger to relieve him. Schlesinger called him back. Now, Noel Geiler is telling me this. And he said to Schlesinger, this is insanity. I'm not going to play this game. There is no place for nuclear war, the use of nukes. Schlesinger said, don't worry about it. We're never going to use nukes. It's used to deter. And then you go back and you think of the guns of August, where nobody wanted war, but 4 years later Europe was devastated with nukes. Civilization is gone. Now the question you asked me, would people actually do this? I believe many would. Is it irrational? Of course it's irrational. I never met a senior person when I would interview them. I taught a course on leadership, command and leadership, all 4 stars. Going back to Ira Aker from World War II, he was one of my favorites. All the way through Arleigh Burke, Bill Depew, I could name the people, Maxwell Taylor, all these people. Do you honestly believe you could start any tactical nuclear war and avoid going to all-out nuclear war? No. I know of one general that tells me to another general now that he thinks you could contain it to the tactical battlefield. We are now developing weapons, smaller weapons that are more efficient to use in tactical. You know that now. I don't have access to it. It's just public knowledge. Are we nuts? Are we crazy or what? I spent 47 years in the Department of Defense as a civilian and in uniform. I will put my patriotism second to none. My wife's first husband was killed defending something that he believed in Vietnam. I am not going to take any of this crap about I'm a wimp that I will not die. I volunteered in the middle of the Korean War. I didn't go to Korea. I expected to as a forward observer in the artillery. When they opened up for volunteers to go to Vietnam, I raised my hand and went there believing in the cause to build a nation and defend freedom. I came back a year later saying, do not go beyond advisory row. Do not. So on nuclear weapons, as you may know, I've been with the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. You may or may not know, but I've been associated. I'm on the National Advisory Board now. I've been for 15 years. We work with people like the Zero Club, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, William White, former Secretary of Defense. You got 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats there, who will tell you there is no use for nuclear weapons in the world today. You will find a plaque, a bronze plaque, in the headquarters of the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation with 100 senior retired people saying the same thing. Included in that is General Bernie Rogers. After I had a discussion with him right after he retired, when he said, "John, that's our doctrine." He kept saying that, and then 2 years later he signed that and told one of my neighbors who had been a senior civilian in the Pentagon. He said, "I don't know what he meant, but General Rogers told me to tell John Johns he understood exactly what I was saying." That. There's no question that he knows. But John, it's our doctrine. Doctrine hoping that you can deter by making them believe you're going to do it. And I had one retired chief of staff of the Army said, yes, it would lead to that, because I asked him after a lecture. He said, but it depends on how much you want to worship your God the way you think you should. Those were the words he used. To worship your Christian God, you're willing to eliminate mankind. I don't know how to deal with that. I don't think, what I think the problem you have is people in a bureaucracy, particularly like the military, where you have to inculcate the notion that you do what you're told. You learn to not think about these unpleasantries. I think that's what I did as the assistant division commander of the 1st Infantry Division.
And obviously you were not alone. I mean, I did the same. I was a military officer.
Yeah.
You know, never in that position, but...
Well, I was never in the position to do it. But I was in the position where if we went to...
Hannah Arendt wrote of Eichmann in Jerusalem, the banality of evil, and really just pointing out that he's a bureaucrat, you know, doing what he was told. And if you think about it, you know, that's what they do in every army.
Go back and watch.
Which is not to defend Eichmann, but it's not to defend war criminals.
Look, the whole Nuremberg trial, the victors determine. 7 days in May. When that came out, people say that never happened in the United States. Bullshit. You delete that. But would people... I see signs of it in the United States. I won't say what it is, but political will, where people just ignore the unpleasantries. I don't know if I didn't have children and grandchildren, whether I would give tinkers down. I would like to think I would still care, but I do have children and grandchildren.
I've read recently that Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, he was genuinely concerned that there could be a military coup against him because of the anger being expressed toward him by the military and CIA, that he persuaded the movie producer to do the 7 Days in May movie, which was in production when he got assassinated. So they held it up, its release up until later that following year. But it was really driven by Kennedy's request. This is what I've read.
That will probably always be apocryphal, but it has a ring of truth to it. I am sure that Kennedy, as effective as he was, had thought that. And let me tell you, Todd, I was never a senior official. I was a brigadier general, but I sat in, and later, as an assistant secretary of defense, deputy assistant secretary of defense. On 2 occasions I sat in on SecDef meetings. One of those meetings was the decision for Reagan to send the battalion of Marines into Beirut. The commandant of the Marine Corps On one of the two occasions I had to sit in for the Assistant Secretary of Defense, he designated me to sit in on the Second House meeting. The discussion was Reagan's proposal to send a battalion of Marines into Beirut. And the Commandant of the Marine Corps said this will be a disaster waiting to happen. The Army Chief of Staff seconded that. I do not remember who else spoke up, but I do remember Caspar Weinberger saying, prepare me a memo to President Reagan stating this, our opposition to doing this. General Rogers was Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. When they put them down there, he asked the Secretary General, he wanted to go down there and look at that because it worried him. And the Secretary General said, no, have nothing to do with that decision. I don't, technically they're under you, you didn't have a voice in putting them down there. Stay away. General Bernard Rogers told me this personally. He and I had hours of discussion after he retired. For whatever reason, he and I had become sort of philosophical soulmates, even while we were on active duty. And I was a colonel and he was a 4-star. We had these, but after he retired, he and I had a lot of these discussions. Do I think the military today has lulled themselves into a false sense of security that they are developing these small tactical nuclear weapons to think that they can use them without turning to total nuclear war? Look, I'm a psychologist. I'm a social psychologist by education, in spite of being the jack of all trades in social science and what I'm talking about here. I'll be honest with you, I don't have trust and confidence in leadership that they would say no to a deranged, let's say, Richard Nixon, when he was under pressure. Now, you may know this, and I don't know this for a fact, but I've been told by so many people, including generals who know, that the Secretary of Defense sent out a message to all commands, all major commands, do not take any instructions from the White House unless it comes through us. Have you ever run across it?
I've heard of that.
You've heard of it? I have full confidence by the one major general that told me he was involved in transmitting that it's true. 7 days in May, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I'd be surprised if Kennedy was not afraid of that. Because there were people, as you know, like Curtis LeMay, beating the drums for war to include the use of nukes. Now, I'm not one that would second-guess Truman's use of nukes to end World War II. But by now, and after I got in the Army and had something to do with them, from a practical matter, I would say, you can't get rid of them. Even Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, the other people I mentioned, Sam Nunn, who've been trying to do the nuclear countdown, is to stop the nuclear arms race. And now even Obama seemed to give a nod to modernizing.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that. My interaction with the Obama administration, I had two friends. One of them became his chief of staff. And the other one became Secretary of Defense. And the communication with them, they were less hawkish, not beating the drums for war, along with Joe Biden. Now, all of this is public knowledge, you know, public knowledge. And I won't say what one of them told me personally that he brought up at every meeting with the president about Syria, about get off this business of trying to overthrow Assad and work with Russia.
Could you clarify for me, who were you saying these people were? I mean, that were talking about Syria?
The hawks were Hillary Clinton, Secretary of Defense, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power. That's pretty well known. They were hardliners.
Right.
Hardliners. Secretary of Defense. And his chief of staff took him a walk in the Rose Garden and told him to withdraw that red line. The red line that was ambiguous about the use of chemical weapons by Assad. Not that he should have ever used the red line. I won't argue that. There are certain tactics, but you'd never make a threat that you're not going to carry through. Unlike some other presidents we have who are constantly saying, I'm going to do this. I don't even want to talk that I'm retired now about a specific president. I would say I was a big supporter of Obama and most of the things he did. I liked his opening to the Muslim world, his speech in Cairo and this. But he got pulled into overthrowing Gaddafi. Syria, taking a hard line on Crimea and the Ukraine. And I'm going to just tell you my view here because they're known. If you go back and read the article I wrote in Foreign Policy with Les Gebb and Lieutenant General Bob Gard, both people of some standing, that we ought to work with Iran and Russia and Assad and get rid of this trying to impose our views on the Middle East. And I personally think we have been stupid toward Iran. And the way we're now reneging, I just think this is a tragic mistake. When I was talking to General Kuyat, the former head of the Bundeswehr, same as the chairman of our Joint Chiefs. He had all the services, and then the committee chair, the military committee of NATO. He was telling me how he worked with Russia, including Putin, when he was there, but this was under Schroeder. He's not in good standing here now among a lot of people. But the notion of paranoia toward Russia, we helped engineer the overthrow of the government of the Ukraine that was leaning toward Russia, staying out. We helped engineer their overthrow to put in a government that would come overboard to NATO. From what I know in public. I don't know any classified information. I'm convinced of this. In the same way with Crimea. In 2008, at the Democratic Convention, the Deputy Secretary of Defense of Georgia, that southern region that had former part of Russia, the Deputy Secretary of Defense learned that I was with a group out there. And he came over and was lobbying me for us to get Georgia into NATO. What do we expect Russia to do when we are trying to put all around them NATO tentacles? Look, I'm for trying to understand legitimate. I'm not a Trump supporter. Whatever he's listening to on that, not meddling in our politics. But Russia, Kuyat thought that Putin could well be worked with. And right at the time that Kuyat was trying to work through me to get a group of retired ambassadors and generals to form a committee to talk, to get some lessening of the tension between us and Russia. There was a former professor at the U that had just come back from Moscow, and he sent his trip report to Bob Gard, who used to be his boss. And Gard sent it to me, and I sent it to Les Gelb, and he says, I'm convinced the Russian hierarchy, including their military, are eager to have a working relationship with us. And so Les Gelb said, let's follow this up. It's all by email. And this former professor said, I'm going to a dinner next Monday night, in which a lot of people will be there, including H.R. McMaster, the new National Security Advisor. I will bring this up with him and say, we see that Trump wants to establish better relationship. You need this institutional of retired senior people who will help do that. And McMaster's response to him is the president feels that the only connection he needs is his personal relation. That he believes that his person, well, you know what the situation is there. Now you want to ask me as a psychologist what this is.
Let me ask you a question. In 2002, and this was reported because it was leaked, reported in the New York Times, and you can find it online. It's what was called the Draft Defense Planning Guidance, prepared by the Secretary of Defense Office, which is Dick Cheney, and then Paul Wolfowitz, and Zalmay Khalilzad takes credit for actually writing it. And it was leaked by somebody, but it basically declared that the world was now subject to U.S. military domination.
Oh, yeah.
So the Allies complained, and Zalmay Khalilzad brags in his memoir of a couple years ago that, yeah, we rewrote it a little bit, but we didn't change the meaning in any way. And then when you take that, and you look at, Russia, what's happening around Russia as a whole, it reminds you of that game Stratego, where you used to play a game with kids and you try to encircle somebody.
Yes.
And
you put your arms around now. If you hit me first, you're...
Yeah, I'm thinking of that board game or whatever, but you're trying to encircle each other's countries.
I used to do that with my brother.
Yeah.
Get him in a corner and say, if you hit me, you hit me first.
So here, the concern that, I don't mean to talk too much, but the concern Khrushchev had during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we had missiles in Turkey, I believe, that could be in Moscow.
And he agreed to withdraw them.
And now we've got missiles, or potentially could have missiles in Ukraine because of the coup, and in Georgia,
Look,
and elsewhere, that could hit Moscow within a minute.
See, we can get, if you want, this is beyond the scope of how we're going to go about. My national strategic interests, not military strategy, but national
Right.
strategy. Says you have to look at the international system and see the relationship between governments and non-governmental actors and realize what is a practical way of humans getting along together without killing each other and get into a win-win relationship. The history of mankind has been from families to clans to tribes killing each other until they get exhausted and say we have to give up some of this sovereignty and establish a higher control. And you give up some of your sovereignty. And you go from city-states to nation-states. We try to go to international systems. We established international institutions after World War II, most of them by us, dictated by us, based on liberal democracy and free markets. And we dictated the terms. A lot of people want to go back to that. That document in 2002, I've got it somewhere in my file. I don't know where it is, but I forgot what it's called. It's called the American Century.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I know exactly.
There were a number of things that come out right around.
Oh yes. It was the neoconservative view. Francis Fukuyama wrote about that in the end of history. Now we're going to do it. And Cheney and his daughter, now a congresswoman, they want to do that. I don't think the Democrats were afraid of this enough. And I don't think the military was. I don't know who in the military is yielding to this development of more tactical nuclear weapons. I don't know. I don't know anyone in the Pentagon. I don't know anyone.
You know, I think I saw it.
I knew McMaster as a captain. I've got his book in there,
Okay.
Dereliction of Duty, with his note to me. I was the first person he talked to write that book.
I gotta admit, I read it, maybe I read it wrong, but in a way he was criticizing the Joint Chiefs because they weren't demanding enough of Johnson for truce. Maybe I read it wrong.
No, it was partly that. He's a hawk. He was a hawk against Iran. I sent him a note and said, yes. One thing, you go back to the Joint Chiefs meeting in the tank that night and deciding they would all resign in protest. You know that story.
I think I do. Maybe you could.
The next morning they got together and they said, if we do this, the American people will no longer have any confidence in them. And Harold K. Johnson said, but I have to do it. Gets in his staff car, unpins his stars, and goes over there, but turns around and comes back. Now,
But what were they protesting?
we shouldn't be in Vietnam
Okay.
without calling up the reserves
That's okay.
without going far enough in there. See, and that's probably what
That's what I read.
McMaster. Yeah. So you're probably right there, but Harold K. Johnson said that was moral cowardice. He put that to do. And I'm telling you,
So-
basically, what.
You mentioned the Pentagon Papers when I'd asked you about dissent. Could you repeat
Yeah.
what your dissent?
Well, the first that I knew about the Pentagon Papers was when the New York Times released it, and then they tried Ellsberg, and there is a documentary on him as well as a documentary on Vietnam. Plus, the movie, The Pentagon Papers of the Washington Post, which is basically accurate, according to the people I've talked to.
Would you explain for anybody watching who doesn't know what the Pentagon Papers were?
Yeah, they were how we got involved in the Vietnam War. And there was a 30-year-old Assistant Secretary of Defense, former reporter for the New York Times in Vietnam, Leslie Gelb, G-E-L-B. Later, the editor of the New York Times, head of the Foreign Relations Council, later the Assistant Secretary of State. This guy has all the credentials, but at that time he was a 30-year-old Assistant Secretary of Defense. And he had a Lieutenant Colonel, Robert Guard, now Lieutenant General retired Robert Guard, pull people together, including a former Marine Captain, Daniel Ellsberg, who was a key worker, big supporter of the Vietnam War. And they pulled all of this stuff together, classified, and in essence, these papers said, this started in the late to mid-60s, after the fact. And they said there were certain things hidden from the American people, but by and large, Les Gelb would say, if you look at the facts, the American people went along with this. His view is that the American people willingly were led into this Vietnam War. All they did was to accumulate and explain it. Well, here is the loyal dissent, and I've discussed with Les, and I'll tell you what he has told me. I shouldn't quote him on this for record, except he has said he has come to believe that it was a good thing to release the Pentagon Papers. At the time, he did not. But Daniel Ellsberg said the American people need to know how they are led into a war like this by people who knew better for various reasons, whether not going as much, but this group of 105 generals will tell you that the liberal press did not lose this war for us. And that's horse manure.
That's one thing I want to ask you about, too.
Oh, yeah. Tony McPeak, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, was interviewed on that with Joe Galloway and others on this when they were interviewed on the Vietnam series. You know, the Vietnam by Ken Burns?
Yeah.
That series, all of those. Les Gelb was interviewed on that. Tony McPeak, I don't know what that noise. Tony McPeak, all kind of other people. Got a book by him in there. This guy wrote on Vietnam, but there was a debate about whether or not people should know things like that, loyal dissent. Now, whether or not we went into Cambodia and Laos when they accused John Kerry of lying with the Swift voters because he had been court-martialed, come on. Everyone in the Pentagon knew that. I heard the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army on the red phone. I was in there. I was a lieutenant colonel or colonel, and I was in the red phone rang. I got up and he motioned me to sit there, and I heard him explain to the White House how you cover up. I didn't even tell my wife that for 5 years. Oh, we do things like that. Mm-hmm. On this, of going out to the public on something like being misled, as we were into Iraq. Mushroom clouds over Manhattan. if you're a propagandist, you know it's alliteration, M over M. Not mushroom clouds, might have been mushroom cloud over Milwaukee or Manhattan, but not mushroom over Cincinnati.